Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Linda Kay Klein, and she's here today to share with us her new book, Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. Now, Linda is the founder of Break Free Together. She earned her master's degree from New York University, which focused on American evangelical Christian gender and sexual messaging for girls, and has spent over a decade working at the cross-section of faith, gender, and social change. So let's welcome to the show, Linda Kay Klein.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, what a pleasure it is to have you here. And my goodness, your book really touched my heart. And I think it helps a lot of women across all different levels. I can't wait for us to start diving into all of it.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. That means a lot to me.
Yeah. Well, and, so why don't you share with our listeners that are new to your story, like the inspiration, what even started you on this path?
So this really started as a very personal story, long before, I got into this process of doing interviews with other people, and the book is a merger of personal story and the stories of many, many other people as well. But long before I was talking with others, I was just one person feeling broken, feeling alone, feeling scared, and thinking I was the only one. So I had grown up in the Evangelical Christian church and had learned the purity message. I was actually in junior high in 1991. I went into 7th grade, and so it was the very beginning of the purity movement, which very quickly became the purity industry, which you might, think about the purity rings and purity balls and purity pledges and other purity products that we started to see around this time. So I really grew up in the midst of that, believing that there were two types of girls and women, as I had been taught, those who are pure and those who are impure. And, along those same lines are, if you're pure, then you are good wife material. And if you're impure, you're lucky if any good Christian man ever loves you. If you're pure, we know you're a Christian. If you're impure, we're not so sure. And it just created a tremendous amount of anxiety in me growing up because you never quite knew when you were going to lose the purity stamp, because it was really ambiguous what made you pure and what didn't make you pure, because all sexual thought and feeling and behavior was suspect. But it really wasn't until I actually left the evangelical community because of these teachings that made me feel so full of anxiety, so full of fear, so full of shame, really, that I realized how deeply they had gone inside of me. Because in my early 20s, I left. I had rejected the idea that I should be experiencing this kind of shame and fear and anxiety, and yet it was still living inside of me and still controlling so much of my life. And that was a very scary, scary thing to realize, that I didn't have as much control over my body or my mind or my feelings as I thought I had.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because when you get this kind of messaging from a church, and we talked earlier, and I grew up Catholic, and they didn't use the pure words, but it was basically the same type of thing in their messaging to young girls, And so you get this feeling, and they're telling you too that you have to follow a certain path or you're going to have forever damnation, and it's a lot of pressure to put on young women and girls, as they're going forward. It's horrible.
Yeah, particularly because you're not only shamed for your own sexual thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but in a purity culture, which I would say that, purity culture is bigger than communities that use that purity language, right? But, in a purity culture, women and girls are ultimately held responsible for everyone's sexual thoughts and feelings and behaviors. I remember growing up and being told, the men and boys are sexually weak, and because you don't have as great of sexual feelings, it's your responsibility to make sure that you walk just right, talk just right, dress just right, to make sure that no one has any sexual thoughts or feelings or behaviors. So you aren't just living in anxiety about your own life, but you're also living in anxiety about the lives of others that you're said to be responsible for.
Yeah. It's just a lot of pressure. Well, I know you talk about the differences between guilt and shame, and I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Absolutely. So this is something that any big Brene Brown fan will know. But, when I say shame, I'm not talking about bashfulness or shyness. When I say shame, I'm talking about the research definition of shame, which is this feeling I am something bad, or people will think that I am something bad, as opposed to guilt, which is this feeling I did something bad. Now, some people are naturally prone to experience guilt or experience shame, but we can also make somebody more likely to experience shame by shaming them. And that is something that I feel like is happening in purity cultures. So, for instance, even teaching somebody that you are pure or you are impure, right? Based on this one thing about you, other people's feelings about your sexuality is an inherently shaming idea. It's not about what choices you make. It's not about what you do. It is about who you are at your core. And that's a problematic thing for us to be training girls in. And ultimately, the conclusion that I reached, as I started to talk to the amount of people who are experiencing shame in their adult lives, is that we had actually, through this consistent shaming message, which is embedded into sexuality education in the Evangelical church, but much broader as well, we are actually creating sex shame brain traps in people. So if I can just talk a little bit about neurobiology, so there's a common axiom called Hebb's axiom that says that neurons that fire together wire together. So if two neural circuits, such as sexuality and shame, are fired simultaneously often enough, then eventually firing the neural circuit for one will automatically activate the neural circuit for the other. And that's really what I saw happening in my life as an adult and in the lives of so many other people as an adult. It's that we had been taught about our bodies, taught about our sexuality via the lens of shame so many times over and over that this shame sex brain trap had developed, so that now that we're adults, for some of us, just looking in the mirror and seeing our curvy body can fill us with a tremendous shame and anxiety. Whereas for others, it's sexual thoughts or feelings or actually trying to have sex or having sex successfully.
Well, it's interesting. If we look at this, just how much pressure is put on young girls as opposed to young boys and men. I mean, women have been carrying the brunt of this for generations.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Oftentimes when you see a man or a boy express sexuality, he's talked to like he messed up. I actually was just talking with a gentleman about this yesterday, and he was talking about how he feels a tremendous amount of shame himself, but he said, then you're talked to about how you messed up. And I said, gosh, what I would have given to be told I messed up, because that is a guilt frame. You did something wrong. You messed up. And what we were told was something very different. We were told you are messed up. So I'll give you an example. One of my interviewees tells a story. This is actually a very, very common story that I've heard from many, many different people with different variations on it. But she tells this story about how when she was learning about sexuality, a woman held up an Oreo cookie before a room full of adolescents, that this girl was one of the adolescents. Held up the Oreo cookie and said, "Who wants this Oreo cookie?" Everyone raises their hand. Everyone wants the cookie. Then she passes the cookie around the room, and she has every person in the class spit on it or drop it on the ground. By the time it comes back to the room, of course, the Oreo cookie is disgusting, and she holds it up in front of the room again, and she says, "Now, who wants this cookie?" Nobody raises their hand, and it's explained that this is an illustration for a girl or a young woman who, before she's had sexual experience and after she's had sexual experience, when now nobody will want her. So men and boys are allowed to mess up. Women and girls become messed up. We become that disgusting Oreo cookie that now nobody will want. And that's very deeply problematic teaching that sticks with people, for many of us, for our entire lives.
Well, and I know that you've done hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews during the course, just of your career here. When you were doing that, what are some of the common feelings that, like, grown women are telling you that they're struggling with?
I mean, the thing that was the big aha for me was the number of people who had experienced this physical holding of the shame and the fear and the anxiety that for some people was manifesting in ways that were mimicking classic PTSD. And that was actually something that I had experienced myself, which is one of the reasons I had felt so alone, because, why was I experiencing these things? Why was I having nightmares? Why was I having, freakouts when I would try to be sexual? And then when I started to talk with more and more people and realized how common it was, I started to understand, oh no, there's something much larger going on. I'm by no means alone. The thing that is most extraordinary about my story is, in fact, how ordinary it is. So for some people, it is nightmares, and it's this sort of constant state of fear and anxiety that they don't talk about, and that just lives in the background, throughout their lives. For other people, it's a more pronounced anxiety that might show up in their bodies. For me, when I would feel it, my eczema would come out, right? Other people were actually having full-on panic attacks and were being sent to the hospital. And again, fear, for some people, the fear was quiet. For others, it was becoming so extreme that it almost developed into a kind of paranoia. So this commonality about this sexual fear and shame and anxiety being held in the body, and then the body expressing it in ways that made us feel completely terrified, because these are terrifying experiences, were really our bodies talking to us, and our bodies trying to get us to deal with the ways in which this was damaging and hurting us, that we needed to deal with, but that we had been taught that we shouldn't deal with, because we had been taught that this fear and shame and anxiety was actually appropriate because these are shameful feelings, shameful thoughts, etc.
It's so heartbreaking to hear that, but it's so encouraging that your book also has been so well received, because you're addressing a pain that our culture has felt, again, like I was saying, for generations, but hasn't been able to really know how to address. And I really think your book, Pure, brings it out in such a way that people can start having a dialogue around it, where it's been kind of that quiet thing in the closet that no one wants to touch,
I completely agree. And I want to underscore what you said about the culture, because, I really look at the evangelical church, even more specifically the white American evangelical church's impact on girls in the book. But the reality is that I've talked with people from many, many different types of communities, people of color, people of various ethnicities, people from other forms of Christianity, people from other religions, people from secular society. And this approach to how we talk to girls about sex and sexuality is almost universal. And, so for example, when you and I talked a little about this earlier, in my community, I learned that there are two types of girls, pure and impure. But in society, we hear about good girls and bad girls. And our definition is exactly the same thing. We're not talking about how often they volunteer. We're talking about their sexual lives and other people's perceptions and assessments of their sexual lives. So this is a much bigger problem than this one community. The look at this one community, I think, can show us how heavy doses of this toxic messaging can affect people in a way that is instructive for all of us to understand, because we're all taking in this toxic messaging because it is really in the air in our society and in our world.
You're so right about that, and I'm so glad that you brought that up and talked about it, because I look back in my childhood growing up. I mean, I went to Catholic church, and it was an experience, and it's not like this. I think all for everybody, but for me, my experience was that I was told that if you messed up in any way, you were totally bad, couldn't be thinking about any boys, couldn't date, couldn't do any of that, because, then that puts you in the bad category. And it's so interesting what we're telling our young girls, how we're trying to, and we're making this clear distinction, between young girls and young boys of what's appropriate, what isn't. And, it just has me kind of thinking, it's like, when is this going to stop? And I think your book, Pure, really helps us to be able to address that.
I hope so. I mean, that's why I wrote it. I wrote it because, well, first of all, I wrote it because other people need to know they're not alone, and it would be great if they didn't have to go on a 12-year journey, around the country interviewing people to know that the way that I did. So I wrote it for the many, many more people out there who need that message that I, at one point so desperately needed. But I also wrote it because the more stories that we hear, the more that we can start to understand that these teachings, which I get that, from a pure logic point of view, it seems like they would work. It seems like they would be fine. It seems like if you would just teach people, to not have sex, that we could, cut back on STIs, and we could cut back on all kinds of, challenges. I understand that was the logic that some of the logic that people were using going into it, that people largely were teaching these things and are teaching these things in an attempt to help people. But the more that we look at how this actually affects people's lives, not how we hope it will affect people's lives, but how it actually affects people's lives, the more that it becomes clear that, no, we have some deeper work to do. We need to go further. We can't continue to think about this in a vacuum of what we hope will work. Let's actually look at the data of how it impacts people, and let's take that into account, and let's rethink how we talk to girls.
Oh, I love that. I really love that because, in your book, you really do talk about how women and young girls, they're suffering from things like not only the anxiety, but fear and PTSD, and what a horrible way to grow up.
Yeah, especially when you think you're alone, because, the shame message teaches you that the reason that you're experiencing things like this is because you ought to be. You're doing something wrong. Either you're sinful or you're broken. And if you don't know that others are experiencing it, that's a very believable message. It's very easy to say, well, I must have done something wrong, or I must be something wrong, and that's why I'm suffering in these ways, because surely no one else is having these experiences, because these stories are generally stories that people lock deep inside of themselves because they are so shameful for many people. So especially when we think that we're alone, it can be a very painful and dangerous thing. But I think when we start to realize that we're not alone, I think that, certainly for me and for my interviewees, that really is the beginning to a road of healing. Because once you realize you're not alone, then you become not the problem. I remember when I realized that there were others out there saying to myself, oh, I can't be the problem because there are too many of us. So what's the problem? The problem is what we were taught, because we were all taught the same thing, but we all made completely different life decisions. Some people got married. Some people waited to have sex until marriage. Some people waited to have their first kiss until marriage. Some people had sex before marriage. Some people stayed in the Evangelical church. Some people left. People made all different life decisions. And yet the commonalities in our lives were the shame, the fear, and the anxiety, and the teachings around sexuality that I now know have a deep connection.
Well, and gosh, this leads me to my next question. Is there a connection between, just the whole purity culture and now we're seeing this rape culture that has probably been around for some time, but is there a connection between the two of them?
Oh, yes, unfortunately, there's a deep connection between them. Purity culture, because it teaches women and girls that we are ultimately responsible for maintaining the sexlessness of all people, it creates the precedent for a rape culture. So, when I was growing up, I was often pulled aside and talked to about how I walked or talked or dressed. My tank top straps were too thin, or my skirt was too short, or whatever it was. And I would be told, listen, you need to rethink this because you can't be a stumbling block for the men and boys, literally a thing over which they could trip on their way to God. You need to protect our men and boys from their sexual weaknesses, so that they don't have sexual thoughts, so that they don't masturbate, et cetera. And that logic plays out, so clearly in rape culture. One of my interviewees, there's an incredibly sad story that she tells about how she tells her parents that she was gang raped. And the first question that her father asks her is, "What were you wearing?" And that is painful and horrible, and something that neither of them will ever forget, And yet this logic and this conditioning created that moment. When you've been trained over and over and over that girls and women are responsible for all sexual behavior, and because sexual violence is never talked about in the church, certainly in the evangelical church when I was growing up, I never heard about sexual violence, then the result is that sexual violence is assessed by the same rules as consensual sex. Because it's categorized as sex, it's not categorized as violence. So those same questions that you would ask, in a consensual sex experience, "Oh, so he masturbated, what were you wearing?" That's not consensual, I guess, but in a non-violence experience, you would be asking in a sexual violence experience, "Oh, so, he raped you, what were you wearing?"
Wow. And it's interesting. I can actually remember, if we go back in different court cases that had been heard, let's say 20 years ago, there was this kind of stigma that the women were being blamed, and you would hear, "Oh, they were too provocative," or "what they wore at work was too provocative." But you would hear that over and over again, that it's really the woman or the young girl's fault in maintaining that line, that we have to be responsible for all men and all people when we're really only responsible for our own actions.
Absolutely. And I would like to believe that it ended 20 years ago, but alas, I don't think that that's the case. I think we're still there. I think we've become a little more savvy in how we talk about it, but I think that the core belief has not changed, and you can still continue to see it playing out in rape culture.
Mm. So for those that you've interviewed and the people who are picking up your book, Pure, is there healing possible through all this?
Yes, I'm so glad to say that I'm in such a better place today, and I believe that it is precisely because of this journey that I went on, which I think is possible for everyone. But, like I said, I don't think everyone has to take 12 years, because essentially the way that I healed was by putting myself through a kind of, accidental narrative therapy, just telling my story again and again and again, and doing it in a space with other people who experience similar things through the interviews and through other conversations. Because then I was able to then listen to my story told back to me in the stories of others, the details being different, but the core experiences that we shared being so similar that it allowed me to further separate myself from the things that I experienced, to challenge the belief that they were my fault, to challenge the belief that they meant that I was broken, to challenge the belief that that I was ultimately, to blame for these feelings and these experiences, because there were others out there. So I've come to this belief that, and also I should add that my interviewees had the same experience. A number of my interviewees said that our interview was life-changing because they were able to share their stories about something that we are never asked about. Just when's the last time that you were ever asked, what did you learn about sexuality growing up, and what are the legacies of those teachings on your adult life? Have you ever been asked?
I think most people would laugh at that, because I do look back on my childhood, and it really was a lot of, this is bad, don't do that, and then here's a book. That's about it.
Right. But the majority. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, you go to school, and they just had started teaching sex ed at the time, because in their the 70s and 80s, or whatever. And so they hand this book, and you're supposed to make heads and tails of it. And what are you supposed to do with this?
Right, exactly. And then these things continue to impact us as adults, however. But I mean, have you ever been asked about how it impacted you as an adult?
No, I have not.
Right. So like there's something tremendous about that. This massive part of our lives that we're never even asked about, right? So there was something really sacred that happened in my interviews, which was that people were asked and then that we were able to enter into this sacred space of story exchange and realize that we weren't alone. So I was able to tell my interviewees, that story that you just shared with me that you said you've never told anyone before because you think it must make you crazy. Well, guess what? It's the fourth or fifth time I've heard a story like that, which is an incredible experience, I think, for many of us when we think that we're broken and alone. So I've come to believe that we don't break free alone, that I think we only break free together, and that's why I'm so committed to creating more ways for people to go through this story exchange. And so I just started an organization called Break Free Together that offers a variety of ways for people to come into story with one another in a way that feels like a fit for where people are in their healing journeys. Some people are ready to go really public and to share their stories and use a hashtag like the Break Free Together hashtag, whereas others are at a place where they really just need to find one person that they trust to tell their truth to answer that question with, who they know won't judge them, who they won't try to tell them what they're supposed to think and what they're supposed to do, but who really just listen and sit with them in their truth.
Wow, and how empowering is that? I mean, what a beautiful, empowering place to be. And I love the Break Free Together. I think that is fabulous. It's interesting, Linda, when someone reads your book and they look at the work that you've done, even from a young age, you start out your life purpose was to be a missionary, and you kind of are that right now, but in a different way.
I know. You're totally right. The thought has crossed my mind. I'm like, I've not really changed that much.
But what you're doing is you're changing. Yeah, everything for everybody. You're changing the discussion. You're changing, how this is being viewed, and that is really changing the world.
Yeah, exactly. Because, the truth is, to your point, I grew up wanting to be a missionary because there are components of what I learned in this community that were not deeply harming, that were deeply life-giving, and they are many of the things that I still stand on today, radical love, justice, the example of the person of Jesus. I feel very lucky that I've been able to come back to Christianity after having left the subculture I was raised in, and to see it through new eyes and to embrace it in a different way, because there is hope and truth in the faith for people, for some of us. I wouldn't say for everyone, but for me, I was able to find a different kind of relationship with Christianity. And it's interesting because when I was growing up, I really believed that there was only one way to be this, and that when I wasn't that, then I was utterly and absolutely not that. But the reality is I'm the exact same person as I was when I was a kid. I'm somebody who is still just like trying to bring light and life, to my own heart and, to the hearts of others to the best that I can, which is always what faith and purpose and, being a human being has been to me, whether I was embedded in that subculture or not.
Well, I'm so glad that you've taken the life journey that you have, because again, you're with Break Free Together and with your book Pure, you're helping so many women, and also for men to understand what women have gone through as well, but helping the discussion take place, helping us look at how we can change things and move forward. Are you finding that you're getting maybe like a lot of churches or pastors or people who are activists, connecting with you saying, we need to further this discussion?
Yeah, the group that I'm hearing the most from are individuals who are reaching out and saying, this is my story, and thank you for telling it so that I realize I'm not alone. That's the thing I'm hearing the most from individuals who I think felt lost. I am hearing, however, from some churches or representatives of churches, individuals. I just spoke with someone a couple of days ago who pulled me aside in a public setting, actually, and said, I really wanted to introduce myself because I used to be a youth pastor, And I'm really sad about these teachings that I've been a part of, and I'm starting a new church, and I want to do things completely differently. So can we be in touch? So there are people there, and the reason I tell that story about how I was the same person then as I am now is not to say like, oh, I was so great then, I was going for justice then, and I still am now. That's not my point. The reason I tell that story is because I think we live in a society where we think of we're stuck in the culture wars. Whether you're in the evangelical world or outside of it, both sides tend to have this us versus them. We're the good ones, they're the bad ones. And I think that it's important for all of us to recognize, no, we're human. We are struggling with many of the same issues. Like we were talking about before, we might be using pure, impure language in the community and good girl, bad girl language outside of the community. But ultimately, the objectification of women, the blaming of women and girls and other survivors as well, that is survivor-wide, is universal and is something that's much larger. So I just wanted to also clarify, that's why I tell that, is because I think the way forward is for us to really get at the root causes of what we're dealing with here, and not get stuck in the binary that can just continue a bunch of argumentation instead of change.
Oh, I'm with you 100% on that. I think that you really you have kind of spearheaded this movement that has been there. Again, no one wants to talk about it, but everyone thought that it was their own personal battle or their personal journey, and how empowering it is for women and girls to learn that they're not the only one, and there can be healing from this. So my goodness, Linda, where can people connect with you and be part of your community and learn about all the great stuff you're doing?
So I do have a website, which is Linda Kay, Linda Kay Klein, my full name with the K-A-Y spelled out. And on that website, there's a page called Break Free Together, and that talks about the different Break Free Together things that we're putting out. It's a new organization. We're just in our early stages, but I would really love for people to get involved. You can also find it, if you want to skip the Linda Kay Klein part, you can actually just go to breakfreetogether.org, and it'll take you to that page as well.
Well, I highly suggest everyone not only purchase the book Pure, but also become part of the community and involve themselves in Break Free Together. Linda, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. This is an issue that I am delighted to be talking about because it's just that important.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. It has been such a pleasure to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your new book, Pure. Again, if you'd like to connect with Linda, you can at her website, lindaklein.com. Her book Pure is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.